They were warned, not once, but 3 times before sunrise. No matter what the tourists do, don't move. That was the command drilled into every guard's mind before they took their positions outside Buckingham Palace. And this wasn't an ordinary day. Dignitaries were watching. Cameras were live. A single blink out of sync could go viral in seconds. "If one of you flinches today," the captain said, voice low but razor-sharp, "the internet will remember it forever." And yet, as the morning crowd thickened and tourists jostled for phone angles, she appeared. Not loud, not foolish, just different. A woman with quiet authority in her posture, elegant coat, dark eyes that didn't flinch. She didn't run. She didn't scream. She simply walked past the velvet rope like it meant nothing. Gasps echoed. Guards stayed still, except one. The one she faced. Corporal Andrew Hale watched her approach, and though he didn't move, something behind his eyes did. Corporal Andrew Hale had a reputation that needed no exaggeration. 12 years of service. Not one misstep, not one recorded breach of discipline. The tabloids once dubbed him the human statue, and it stuck, because nothing, not jeers, rain, or royal funerals, had ever broken his stare. He'd endured sweltering heat that melted metals into fabric, spit from drunk tourists, and even the quiet chaos of protesters flinging banners near his boots. Not once had he twitched. He was 34 now, tall and solidly built, with a quiet authority that didn't need to shout. A former Royal Marine, he brought battlefield focus to the palace gate. But today, something was different. The moment he spotted her, poised, unshaken, walking straight toward the guard line, his composure held, but his breath faltered. No one could see it, but beneath the ceremonial coat, just over his heart, was a thin envelope, yellowed slightly at the fold. A note handed to him 3 years ago. He'd never opened it. Not because he was afraid of what it said, but because he already knew who it was from, and why it still mattered. She didn't come with a camera, didn't elbow her way to the front for selfies or shout absurd dares like others had before. She simply appeared, elegant in a slate-gray trench coat that moved like smoke behind her, heels striking the cobblestones with deliberate rhythm. Her presence parted the crowd without a word. No security flinched, no official stepped in. She stopped exactly 1 foot from Corporal Hale. Her gaze, direct, unflinching, met his like a quiet challenge. Then, in a voice barely louder than the wind brushing their uniforms, she asked, "What are you guarding, really?" The hush was immediate. Someone gasped. A tourist's phone lowered mid-recording, but Andrew didn't blink, not even a twitch. Yet deep inside, something shifted, something old and buried. That voice, the timbre of it, it didn't belong to a stranger. It reached further back, before the palace, before the Marines, back to a promise made beneath very different skies, and for the first time in years, his heartbeat skipped. Years ago, Sierra Leone. The air had been thick with heat and the scent of iron-rich soil, chaos crackling just beyond the makeshift camp's thin metal fences. Andrew was younger then, but already carved from discipline. It was there, during a late-night ambush, that a bullet tore through his side. He remembered the sharp crack of gunfire, the blinding pain, and the sound of his own breath slowing. But above all, he remembered her, Amara, a young nurse with fierce eyes and a voice that steadied his spiraling world. She had knelt beside him, hands soaked in blood, whispering, "Stay with me, soldier," like a command that his body dared not disobey. And then, just days later, she vanished. No farewell, no explanation, just silence. He never found her again, until now. She stood inches from him, her voice unmistakable, unchanged by the years. Was this a test? A coincidence wrapped in fate? Or something more deliberate, meant only for him? The courtyard spun quieter than before. His grip on the rifle held, unmoving, but behind his stoic eyes, memories surged like floodwater. His breath faltered, once lightly, but not even the sharpest lens could catch it. Only he knew the battle raging beneath that stillness. She knelt without hesitation, not to bow, not to mock, but to reach. One slender hand extended toward his polished black boot, and with a gentle, deliberate motion, she wiped away a streak of dried mud clinging to the heel. A murmur rolled through the crowd like a ripple in still water, then erupted. Some laughed, thinking it a prank. Others gasped, unsure whether to intervene. A child nearby clapped, not understanding the gravity, but sensing something extraordinary had just happened. Phones flew up. Shutters clicked. Streams began. But amidst the storm of attention, Corporal Hale stood as if cast in iron. His body didn't flinch, not even as her hand lingered for a second longer than it should have. But inside was war. Not the kind with gunfire and sand, but the kind that cracks something deep within a man who has lived too long in silence. Amara rose slowly, her eyes locked with his. Then, softly, too softly for the cameras but loud enough to rattle the foundation of his discipline, she whispered, "Break rank for something real, or stay a statue forever." Her breath brushed against his cheek like memory. For a moment it felt like the entire world narrowed to just those words. And though no muscle moved, a fracture ran through the armor he'd spent a lifetime perfecting. The silence that followed her words was louder than any cheer. Corporal Hale stood motionless, but his breath was no longer steady. Beneath the rigid wool of his red coat, just over his heart, something stirred. His gloved hand drifted, slow, deliberate, to the inner lining of his chest plate, and then, without ceremony, without permission, without fear, he let go of the rifle. It dropped with a dull, almost reluctant thud onto the stone. The sound echoed across the courtyard like a gunshot. Gasps surged through the crowd like a storm wave breaking against centuries of silence. Every phone was up now. The Queen's Guard had moved, and not just moved, but broken formation. But Andrew Hale wasn't watching the crowd. His eyes were fixed on her, on Amara, as his fingers withdrew a single folded piece of paper, yellowed at the edges, the crease worn soft from years of being untouched. He had carried it since the day her name appeared on the casualty list, the day her convoy was lost to fire and smoke in the jungle. It had arrived weeks later, with his name on the envelope and hers on the back, but he had never opened it. Until now. His hands trembled as he unfolded it, the paper catching sunlight like a relic. The wind tugged gently at the corners, as if the letter itself was breathing again. His eyes never left hers, like this moment had been waiting in both of them all along. The crowd had fallen into a hush so complete, even the wind seemed to still in reverence. Corporal Hale stood frozen, yet entirely awake, as his eyes traced the words written in a familiar, looping hand. And as he read, her voice returned, not from her lips, but from memory, from somewhere deeper than sound. "Andrew, if you're reading this, then I'm gone. But I never wanted your silence. I wanted your truth. I saw in you something the world kept trying to break, a man who could still feel even in uniform. Don't become the god they train you to be. Be the man I met. The world doesn't need another statue, it needs someone willing to move." His fingers clutched the letter like it was air itself, his chest rising once before he crouched low, ceremony shattered, yet soul intact. Gently, he placed the letter at her feet, the paper curling slightly against the stone as if bowing too. Then he stood, stepped back with military precision, and brought his hand to his brow in a salute, not to the crown, not to the protocol, but to her, to what she reminded him of. The courtyard didn't erupt. It froze. No cheers, no outbursts, just hundreds of eyes unblinking. Even the loudest tourists said nothing, because in that single act of quiet defiance, something sacred had happened, and everyone watching knew they'd never forget it. The room was small, windowless, and cold, more chamber than courtroom, the kind of place where secrets are handled, not heard. Corporal Hale stood at attention beneath the flicker of a single overhead light, the air thick with judgment. 3 high-ranking officers sat opposite him behind a long oak table, their uniforms adorned with decades of quiet power. No cameras, no journalists, just consequence. "You've humiliated the Royal Guard," the central officer said, his voice clipped, tight, unrehearsed. Hale said nothing. His face betrayed no emotion. "Was it worth it?" someone asked. Silence again, until without a word Hale reached into his coat, removed the now folded letter, and slid it across the polished surface. It stopped at the hand of the oldest officer, Commander Whitmore, retired once, recalled for moments like this. The man opened it with the care of someone diffusing a memory. His eyes scanned each line slowly. When he finished, he didn't speak. He just leaned back, suddenly looking very old. "This changes nothing," the youngest officer said after a tense pause, trying to reclaim the moment. But another, barely louder than a breath, whispered, "No, it changes everything." No one moved. The paper between them, no longer just ink on a page, but a rupture, a mirror, a reckoning. And Hale, standing silently before them, no longer felt like the one on trial. There was no formal announcement, no public reprimand, just a plain white envelope slid beneath his barracks door before sunrise. Inside, a reassignment, no ceremony, no conversation. Effective immediately, Corporal Andrew Hale was transferred to low-profile detail, security for the palace's private collections, deep beneath the stone corridors of Windsor's forgotten wings. No changing of the guard, no tourists, no velvet ropes or clicking cameras, just silence and artifacts that hadn't seen daylight in centuries. He changed uniforms, too. No crimson, no shining buttons, just black. Simple, almost invisible. And he wore it like armor, not shame. Because he understood now. Not every act of courage is meant for applause. Some are meant to echo in stillness, to exist quietly in the places where truth can live without being torn apart by spectacle. They had hoped to erase him from the public eye, but in doing so, they had given him something else entirely. Peace. The kind that doesn't need validation. The kind that finally lets a soldier rest. Weeks passed. The noise faded. Online clips slowed. The world moved on. But somewhere beneath the palace, in a corridor no one tours, where the ceilings are low and history hums through stone, he remained. It was on a Wednesday, late afternoon, when he heard footsteps that didn't belong to guards or archivists. Soft, deliberate, then a voice, calm, familiar, impossible. "I didn't think you'd remember me," she said, standing at the edge of the hallway's dim light, the same steady fire in her eyes. He turned slowly, his breath catching somewhere between disbelief and inevitability. "I never forgot you," he answered, voice low. "I just froze for too long." There was no judgment in her smile, just patience, grace, and the strength she'd always carried, then and now. She stepped closer, enough for the light to catch the curve of her cheek, the echo of everything unspoken between them. "And now?" she asked. For the first time in years, his answer came without hesitation. "Now I move. Not for duty, not for ceremony, but for the moment that had waited too long to begin. Silence lingered in the corridors long after the world stopped watching, but stories have a way of echoing where cameras can't reach. In quiet corners of the palace, the name Corporal Hale became more than a line in a personnel file. It became a whisper among the ranks. Some called him reckless, others, quietly, called him brave. But none could ignore the ripple he'd left behind. One morning, as recruits lined up under a gray London sky, a young guard, barely 19, turned to him, nervousness hidden beneath crisp red wool. "Was it worth it?" he asked, voice low. Hale looked out across the empty courtyard, then down at the hands that had once held still for too long. "No statue ever saved a life," he replied with a quiet smile. "But a man who moves just might." He didn't lead drills the old way anymore. He didn't shout commands or demand blind obedience. Instead, he taught them the weight of silence, the meaning behind stillness, and the power of knowing when to break it. His final lesson was never spoken aloud, but every recruit carried it with them. Know when to stand. But more importantly, know when to kneel. The wind whispered against the palace gates, as if the stones themselves still remembered. His footsteps no longer echoed in public squares, but his choice lingered like a quiet rebellion etched into tradition. And now, as we close this story, one question remains. Was he right? To break the stillness upheld for centuries, to answer not a command, but a calling. Was love worth challenging the unspoken law? Worth risking legacy for truth? What would you have done, standing in his place? Think about it, then let us know. Because stories like these, stories that stir something deeper, deserve more than silence. So if this moment moved you, don't just scroll away. Tap that subscribe button. Share this story with someone who needs to feel something real again. And remember, sometimes the strongest act of courage is choosing to move when the world tells you to stay still.